There are crimes that shock a nation. There are crimes that change laws. And then there are crimes so depraved, so methodically cruel, that they redefine what human beings are capable of inflicting upon one another. This is the story of a 17-year-old girl who trusted the wrong people in the wrong neighborhood at the wrong moment. What happened to her over the next 44 days would become one of the most horrific documented cases of prolonged torture in modern history. Her name was Junko Furuta. She was not supposed to be a victim. She was an honor student at Yashio Minami High School in Saitama Prefecture, Japan. The kind of girl who worried about entrance exams and part-time job schedules. The kind of girl who believed that if she followed the rules and stayed out of trouble, nothing bad would happen to her. She was wrong. The Misato neighborhood of Saitama Prefecture sat just outside Tokyo's sprawl, one of those areas where working families lived in modest homes and believed their children were safe. The trains ran on time, the streets stayed clean, but safety is an illusion that shatters easily when predators learn to hide in plain sight. And in Misato, 4 teenage boys had been hiding very well. They called themselves the Yakuza, though they were more accurately described as wannabe gangsters. Hiroshi Miyano, 18 years old, was the leader. Nobuharu Minato, 16, provided the location. Joe Ogura and Yasushi Watanabe, both 17, were the followers. Together, they had built reputations as members of the Yakuza-affiliated gang, intimidating classmates and committing petty crimes. But petty crimes bored them. They wanted something bigger, something that would prove they feared nothing and no one. They wanted a girl. On November 25th, 1988, they found her. Junko was cycling home from her part-time job through the early twilight when Miyano and an accomplice staged an attack. One boy knocked her off her bicycle while Miyano appeared from the shadows, playing the hero who had chased off her attacker. She was grateful. In that moment, her fate was sealed. He told her he would walk her home to make sure she was safe. The neighborhood had been dangerous lately, he said. Girls needed protection. She believed him because she had been taught to trust people who offered help. She believed him because he was smiling. She believed him because she was 17 and had no reason yet to understand that evil rarely announces itself with horns and fangs. He walked her directly to Minato's house on Furuta Street in the Ayase district of Adachi, Tokyo. Minato's parents were home. They heard the girl's voice that first night, confused and frightened, asking why they had brought her here instead of to her own home. They heard the laughter of the 4 boys. They heard a door slam upstairs. They heard muffled sounds they chose not to investigate. And then they heard nothing at all, because they made the decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They decided it was none of their business. What happened in that house over the next 44 days defies comfortable explanation. The details exist in Japanese court records and psychiatric evaluations. They exist in the confessions the boys eventually gave, delivered with the casual tone of people describing a hobby. The facts are documented in the Tokyo District Court trial transcripts. The facts are real. But understanding how 4 human beings could systematically torture another human being for nearly 7 weeks requires accepting a darkness most people spend their entire lives denying exists. They started with intimidation, told her that if she tried to escape, they would kill her family. The threat was credible because Miyano had connections to actual Yakuza members, showed her weapons to prove they could, gave her a phone and forced her to call her parents, telling them she had run away with friends and was safe. Her mother believed her because parents want to believe their children are safe. Her father believed her because the alternative was unthinkable. The police closed the missing person case. Nobody was looking for her anymore. Then the torture began in earnest. They burned her. Not once, not in a moment of rage, but repeatedly, methodically, over weeks. They used lighters and cigarettes and fireworks. They burned her face until she was unrecognizable. They burned her legs until she could no longer walk without screaming. They inserted fireworks into her body cavities and ignited them, and they laughed while they did it. Because her suffering had become their entertainment, they invited others. The house became a gathering place for young men who wanted to participate in what the 4 boys proudly described as their ongoing project. Court records would later identify more than 100 different individuals who knew about Junko's captivity. Some participated actively, some watched, some simply knew. None called police. In a neighborhood where families believed they were safe, more than 100 people knew a girl was being tortured to death in a house on their street, and nobody did anything. The psychological mechanism that allows this is called diffusion of responsibility. It probably explains why genocides happen, why crowds watch murders without intervening, why neighbors ignore screams. When everyone knows, nobody feels individually accountable. The crime becomes a shared secret, and shared secrets feel less like crimes and more like uncomfortable facts everyone has agreed to ignore. By the third week, she could barely move. The burns covered so much of her body that infection had set in. Her face was swollen beyond recognition. She had lost control of basic bodily functions. The boys found this disgusting, so they beat her for it. They beat her with metal rods and bamboo swords. They kicked her with boots until bones broke. They forced her to masturbate in front of them. They raped her repeatedly, sometimes inviting friends to participate. When she stopped crying out, they hurt her worse to hear her scream again. They made her eat cockroaches and drink her own urine. They hung her from the ceiling and used her as a punching bag. They dropped barbells on her stomach. They inserted objects into her body that caused internal injuries so severe that even weeks later, autopsy reports would struggle to catalog them all. Court testimony would later reveal that Minato's parents saw her multiple times during those 44 days, saw her injuries, saw her suffering, and did nothing because they were afraid of their own son and his friends. One of them had an idea. They had probably seen a documentary or heard a story about murder cases where victims' bodies had been hidden in concrete. The method was effective. Bodies hidden in concrete could remain undiscovered for decades. The boys decided they would do the same thing, but first, they wanted to see how much more she could endure. By late December, Junko could no longer walk, could no longer control her bowels, could barely speak. They had been torturing her for over a month. They were bored with her, so they devised a new game. They forced her to play mahjong with them. Every time she lost, they punished her, beat her with iron rods, burned her with lighter fluid, set her legs on fire, and watched her try to put out the flames. On January 4th, 1989, during one of these sessions, she lost consciousness and stopped breathing. The exact cause of death would later be listed as shock and traumatic brain injury, though the autopsy revealed injuries so extensive that any one of them could have been fatal. The boys panicked, not because they had killed her, but because they suddenly understood they had a body to dispose of. Minato's parents were downstairs. The house smelled of death and infection and burned flesh. They could not simply carry a corpse out the front door, so they did what they had always planned to do. They stuffed her body into a 55-gallon drum they had stolen, mixed concrete, poured it over her, sealed it, waited for it to harden, and then, in the middle of the night, they loaded the drum into a stolen vehicle and drove it to a construction site in Koto, Tokyo. They dumped it in a lot filled with construction debris and drove away. They thought they had gotten away with it. For nearly 3 weeks, they were right. They returned to their normal lives, attended school, saw friends, acted like nothing had happened. Minato's parents cleaned the room where Junko had been kept and never asked questions. The 100-plus people who had known about her captivity kept silent, because admitting knowledge would mean admitting complicity. But teenage boys are terrible at keeping secrets, especially when those secrets make them feel powerful. The boys were arrested on a separate assault charge in late January 1989. During interrogation, Miyano bragged about what they had done to Junko, described it in detail, proud of the cruelty they had inflicted. Police initially did not believe him. The story was too horrific. But when they investigated Minato's house, they found evidence that corroborated every word. On January 23, 1989, officers obtained a warrant and arrested all 4 boys. When confronted with the evidence, they confessed within hours. They confessed because they did not believe they had done anything worthy of serious punishment. They were minors. They were first-time offenders for murder. They thought the system would protect them. They were right about that too. The concrete drum was excavated on January 24th. When they broke it open, investigators found Junko's body in a position that suggested she may have been conscious when the concrete was poured. The autopsy would later confirm that she had suffered injuries equivalent to being in a severe car accident. Repeatedly, over 44 days, her internal organs were so damaged that medical examiners struggled to identify cause of death because there were too many fatal injuries to isolate one cause. The trial became a national sensation, but not in the way victims' families hoped for. The boys' identities were protected by Japanese juvenile law. Their names were changed in all official documents. The details were sanitized in news reports because the full truth was deemed too disturbing for public consumption. The families of the perpetrators received sympathy, treated as victims of their son's inexplicable actions. Junko's family received hate mail from people who believed she must have done something to provoke such treatment. Hiroshi Miyano received a sentence of 17 years. Nobuharu Minato received 5 to 9 years. Joe Ogura received 4 to 6 years. Yasushi Watanabe received 3 to 4 years. All 4 were released after serving their sentences. Their records were sealed, their identities legally protected by juvenile privacy laws. They walked back into society with new names, new identities, as if 44 days of torture and murder could be balanced by a few years of detention. Miyano was arrested again in 2009 for fraud. Minato was arrested again in 2018 for attempted murder. Ogura was arrested again in 2004 for kidnapping. The system that protected them as juveniles released them to reoffend as adults. Junko's mother, Shizu Furuta, suffered severe psychological trauma and struggled with depression for the rest of her life. Her father, Akira Furuta, fought for decades to change Japanese juvenile law, arguing that protecting the identities of perpetrators was a greater injustice than any punishment the boys received. Their efforts contributed to revisions in Japanese juvenile criminal law in 2000, but those changes came too late for Junko. The case changed Japan. It sparked national debate about the cult of silence that allows atrocities to continue in plain sight. It raised questions about parental responsibility when crimes occur under their own roofs. It forced the country to confront the fact that more than 100 people knew about Junko's torture and did nothing. But debates and questions do not bring back the dead. The house where it happened still stands in Adachi, Tokyo. The construction site where her body was dumped has been developed into residential housing. The boys who tortured her have new names, new identities, new lives. They are protected by law from ever having their crimes follow them. And that is perhaps the most disturbing element of this case. Not the torture itself, though that is horror enough. Not the 44 days of suffering, though that defies comprehension. But the fact that a system designed to protect the innocent instead protected the guilty. The fact that more than 100 people knew and said nothing. The fact that parents heard and chose ignorance. This is not a story about monsters. Monsters are not real. This is a story about human beings who made choices, who chose cruelty over mercy, who chose silence over action, who chose 44 days of torture over one phone call to police. Junko Furuta had dreams of becoming a singer. She worked part-time to save money for her future. She had friends who missed her. She had parents who loved her. She was 17 years old when she died. She had her entire life ahead of her. Instead, she got 44 days of unimaginable suffering and a concrete tomb in a construction site. Her grave is located in Wakasu Park in Tokyo. Every year on the anniversary of her death, strangers visit to leave flowers and notes. They apologize on behalf of the society that failed her. They promise to remember her name. They vow that her death will not be forgotten. But the men who killed her walk free with new identities. The people who knew and did nothing were never charged. The system that failed her continues to fail other victims. The question is not whether something like this could happen again. The question is whether it is happening right now, somewhere, while neighbors and parents and witnesses choose to look away. Because evil does not require monsters. It only requires silence. And Japan has never forgotten the name Junko Furuta, the girl who died because more than 100 people chose to do nothing.